A billionaire's life takes an unexpected turn when he meets a homeless man who looks exactly like him. But as he uncovers the shocking truth behind their connection, he realizes his wealth can't shield him from the secrets of his past or the lessons his newfound brother has to teach him. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more captivating stories like this one. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Let's begin. Thomas Rivers, a billionaire whose life was filled with every luxury imaginable, sat comfortably behind the wheel of his sleek, black luxury car. His days were a whirlwind of important meetings, lavish dinners, and exclusive parties. Life was easy for Thomas. He had everything anyone could ever want. Money, power, and influence were all at his fingertips. But in the midst of all this wealth, Thomas had become completely disconnected from the world outside his bubble of privilege. One afternoon, Thomas was driving through the city on his way to another high-end event. He rarely ventured into the older parts of town, preferring the pristine, manicured streets of the wealthy neighborhoods. But today, traffic had forced him to take a detour through a part of the city he hadn't seen in years, an area where broken-down buildings lined the streets and people without homes huddled under makeshift shelters. As Thomas slowly navigated his car through the run-down streets, something caught his eye. There, sitting on the curb with a ragged blanket around his shoulders, was a man, a homeless man. That sight alone wasn't unusual for this part of town, but something about him made Thomas' breath catch. The man looked exactly like him. Thomas's heart raced as he glanced back at the man, then back at the road. He couldn't believe it. It was as if he was staring at his own reflection, but in an entirely different life. The homeless man had the same deep-set eyes, the same strong jawline, and even the same slight dimple in his chin. Their skin tone was identical, a rich brown, and their hair, although the homeless man's was wild and unkempt, was the same dark texture as Thomas's perfectly groomed curls. Thomas kept driving, but his mind was spinning. Who was this man? Why did he look so much like him? It felt impossible, like some kind of cruel joke or a trick of fate. His fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter as he tried to shake the unsettling feeling that had washed over him. Surely it was just a coincidence. But the resemblance was too striking to ignore. The farther he drove, the more the image of the man on the curb haunted him. Thomas was used to seeing homeless people in the city. He often passed them by without a second thought. But this time he couldn't shake the feeling that this man was somehow connected to him. It gnawed at him, an uncomfortable question forming in his mind. What if my life had been different? What if I had ended up like him? By the time Thomas reached the event he was supposed to attend, he was too distracted to enjoy any of it. The grand ballroom, the lavish dinner, the champagne, it all felt meaningless compared to the strange encounter he'd just had. Throughout the evening, his thoughts kept drifting back to the man on the street. How was it possible for someone who looked so much like him to be living such a different life? The more Thomas thought about it, the more he needed answers. At night, as Thomas lay in his enormous bed in his luxurious penthouse apartment, he couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over in his mind. There was something deeper going on here. He just knew it. He felt a strange pull, as if fate had put that man in his path for a reason. The next morning, Thomas couldn't resist any longer. He had to find that man again. He dressed quickly, his mind focused on the task ahead. He didn't tell anyone where he was going, not his personal assistant, not his chauffeur. This was something he had to do on his own. As he drove back to the part of the city where he had seen the man, Thomas felt a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. What was he going to say? What if the man didn't want to talk to him? What if this was all just a strange coincidence, and there was no deeper meaning to any of it? When Thomas arrived at the same street, he scanned the sidewalks, looking for the familiar figure. And there he was, sitting in the same spot as the day before, wrapped in that same tattered blanket. The man hadn't moved. Thomas parked his car a few feet away and got out, his heart pounding. He approached slowly, unsure of how to begin the conversation. The closer he got, the more he felt like he was walking towards some kind of mirror. Only this reflection showed a life he had never known. The man looked up as Thomas approached, his eyes narrowing in curiosity. There was a strange, unspoken tension between them, as if they both sensed the strangeness of the moment. "Hey," Thomas said, his voice sounding awkward and out of place. "Can I talk to you?" The homeless man studied Thomas for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slight nod, he gestured to the spot next to him. "Sure," he said. Thomas hesitated for a second, then sat down on the curb beside him. The cold concrete felt foreign against his perfectly tailored suit, but he pushed the discomfort aside. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Thomas didn't know how to begin. He had come here with so many questions, but now that he was face to face with the man, the words seemed to slip away. "I saw you yesterday," Thomas finally said, breaking the silence, "and I couldn't help but notice. You look like me." The man chuckled softly, a dry, knowing laugh. "Yeah," he said, nodding slowly. "I noticed that too." Thomas blinked, surprised that Jacob had noticed him before. "Yeah, I do," he admitted. "I own a few businesses. Things have been good for me." Jacob gave a small, knowing smile. "Good for you, huh? Must be nice." Thomas nodded, though he wasn't sure how to respond. He had everything a person could want: money, success, power. But sitting here, beside Jacob, he suddenly felt a strange emptiness inside him. For the first time in his life, he started to question the fairness of it all. "How did you end up here?" Thomas asked carefully, not wanting to offend Jacob, but desperate to understand the man's story. Jacob leaned back slightly, resting his arms on his knees as he gazed off into the distance. "It's a long story," he said softly, his eyes reflecting the years of struggle and heartache. "But I guess you could say life didn't go the way I planned." Thomas stayed silent, waiting for Jacob to continue. "I grew up with nothing," Jacob began, his voice steady but filled with a quiet sadness. "Didn't have much family. My mom worked 2 jobs, and my dad, well, he left before I was born. I had to fend for myself from a young age. Thought I could make something of myself, but life has a funny way of throwing you off track." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I made some bad decisions. Dropped out of school, fell in with the wrong crowd, lost everything I worked for. I tried to get back on my feet, but every time I thought things were looking up, something else would knock me down." Thomas listened, feeling a pang of guilt in his chest. He had been raised in a life of comfort and privilege, never having to worry about where his next meal would come from or how he would pay the bills. Listening to Jacob's story made him realize how easily his life could have gone in a different direction, if not for the fortune he was born into. "But you seem so calm," Thomas said after a moment. "I don't understand how you can be so peaceful, given everything you've been through." Jacob chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. "What's the point in being angry? I learned a long time ago that some things are out of your control. You can either let it destroy you or find peace with it. I chose peace." Thomas was stunned. Here was a man who had lost everything, and yet he had found something Thomas himself was still searching for, inner peace. As they continued talking, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper between them, some unseen connection that went beyond their similar looks. The way Jacob spoke, the calm in his voice, even his gestures, there was something strangely familiar, like they had met before in another life. "Do you ever think about how things might have been different?" Thomas asked quietly, his mind racing. "If you'd been born into a different family or had more opportunities?" Jacob looked at him thoughtfully. "Sure, everyone wonders about that sometimes. What if I had made better choices? What if things had gone my way? But I've learned to let go of those questions. It's not healthy to dwell on what-ifs. Thomas nodded, but he couldn't let go of the thought. As he sat there, listening to Jacob, a deep, unsettling question began to form in his mind. What if our lives had been switched? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. It felt almost like fate had placed Jacob in his path to show him something, to make him question the fairness of his own life. The more they talked, the more Thomas learned about Jacob's past, a life filled with missed opportunities, struggles, and tragedy. It seemed like every door that had opened for Thomas had been slammed shut for Jacob. And yet, they shared the same face, the same features, as though they were mirror images of each other, living in two completely different worlds. One evening, after a long day of meetings and business deals that left him feeling hollow, Thomas sat in his study, staring at the family photo album that had been untouched for years. His parents, once the image of perfection in his eyes, had passed away when he was in his 20s, leaving him their fortune and the responsibility of running the family business. Thomas had always believed his childhood had been flawless, full of love, security, and wealth. But now, doubt crept into his mind. His fingers flipped through the pages, pausing over old photographs of his parents. They smiled back at him, a perfect couple, or so he had thought. But the more he looked at those pictures, the more cracks he saw, strained smiles, distant looks in their eyes. How had he never noticed before? Driven by a strange gut feeling, Thomas headed to the attic, where boxes of old records and documents from his parents' lives were stored. Dust swirled in the dim light as he opened one of the boxes, searching for anything that might provide a clue. Hours passed as he sifted through paperwork, old letters, tax forms, property deeds. It felt like a hopeless task until he found something. At the bottom of one box, wrapped in yellowed parchment, was a letter addressed to his father. The handwriting was delicate but shaky, as if the writer had been nervous. Thomas unfolded the letter carefully, his heart beginning to race. It was from a woman named Sarah, and the letter told a story Thomas could hardly believe. Sarah wrote about an affair she had with Thomas's father many years ago. She described how they had met during one of his father's business trips, and how they had fallen in love despite the fact that he was already married. She had struggled to make ends meet, but he had promised to help her. But there was more. Sarah had given birth to a son. She described him as having the same deep brown eyes and smile as his father. The letter ended with a plea for help. Sarah had no way to support their child, and Thomas's father had promised to take care of them, but somewhere along the way he had cut off all contact. She begged for his help, not for herself, but for the boy. Thomas sat frozen in his chair, staring at the letter. His mind raced, trying to piece together the truth. The boy Sarah wrote about, the son of his father. Could it be Jacob? The timelines matched. The appearance, the resemblance, it all made sense now. Jacob wasn't just some stranger on the street who looked like him. Jacob was his half-brother. The revelation hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. His father, the man he had idolized for so long, had kept a terrible secret. He had abandoned a woman and his own child, leaving them to suffer while Thomas and his mother lived in luxury. He sat in silence for a long time, staring at the letter, feeling his world crumble around him. What was he supposed to do with this information? Should he tell Jacob? Should he reveal that they were brothers? The thought of it filled him with dread. If he told Jacob the truth, it could change both of their lives forever. Thomas's mind raced with questions. What would Jacob think? Would he hate him for living a life of privilege, while Jacob had been left to struggle on the streets? Would he want anything to do with Thomas, or would he resent him for the life he had been denied? There was another part of Thomas, an uglier part, that didn't want to face the consequences of this truth. What would happen if people found out? How would this affect his reputation, his company? His family had built an empire on the image of perfection. This secret would shatter that image, exposing a scandal that could ruin everything. As the hours passed, Thomas wrestled with the moral dilemma. On one hand, he knew that keeping the truth from Jacob would be wrong. Jacob had every right to know where he came from, to know that he had a family, even if it was a family that had abandoned him. But on the other hand, Thomas feared what that truth would do, not only to Jacob, but to himself. Could he live with the guilt of knowing that his father had abandoned Jacob? Could he look at Jacob's face and see the pain of a brother who had been left behind? The more Thomas thought about it, the more torn he became. His father's actions had put him in an impossible position, and now he had to choose: protect the perfect life he had always known, or risk it all by revealing the truth to a man who had every reason to hate him. As the night wore on, Thomas knew he couldn't keep this secret forever. But when the moment came to tell Jacob, what would he say? Would Jacob even believe him? The thought of confronting his half-brother filled him with fear, but he also knew he couldn't walk away from this. Thomas sat in his car, staring out at the street corner where he had first seen Jacob. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced with doubt. He had spent days agonizing over this moment, rehearsing what he was going to say. The letter from his mother still weighed heavily in his pocket, a constant reminder of the truth he was about to reveal. Could he really go through with it? What if Jacob didn't believe him? Worse, what if he did believe him and wanted nothing to do with him? The idea of standing in front of the man who was not just a reflection of himself, but his half-brother, made Thomas's stomach churn. But he knew he couldn't run from this. He owed Jacob the truth. Taking a deep breath, Thomas stepped out of the car and walked toward the familiar figure sitting on the curb. Jacob hadn't moved from his usual spot, his tattered clothes hanging loosely on his thin frame. As Thomas approached, he felt a surge of guilt wash over him. This man, his brother, had been living a life of hardship while he had enjoyed a life of comfort and privilege. "Back again?" Jacob asked, looking up with a faint smile. He seemed surprised to see Thomas, but there was no hostility in his voice. Thomas forced a smile, though his nerves made it difficult. "Yeah, I wanted to talk to you again." Jacob nodded and motioned for Thomas to sit next to him, just like the last time. The two men sat in silence for a few moments, the noise of the city swirling around them. But inside Thomas's head, everything was quiet, except for the thumping of his heart. "I need to tell you something," Thomas began, his voice shaky. "Something important, and I don't really know how to say this." Jacob raised an eyebrow, his expression still calm but curious. "Go on, man. I'm listening." Thomas took a deep breath and pulled the letter from his pocket, holding it in his hands like a fragile piece of his past. He looked down at it, then back at Jacob. "I found this," Thomas said quietly, handing the letter to Jacob. "It's from my mother to my father. I think you need to read it." Jacob looked at the letter for a moment, confused, before slowly taking it from Thomas' hands. He unfolded the yellowed paper, his eyes scanning the words as the truth began to unfold before him. As he read, Thomas watched Jacob's expression change. First confusion, then disbelief, and finally a deep sadness that settled into his eyes. Jacob lowered the letter, staring at it for a long time before speaking. "This is real." Thomas nodded, his throat tight. "Yes, it's real. Jacob, you're my brother." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and undeniable. Thomas's heart raced as he waited for Jacob's reaction, unsure of what would happen next. He had expected shock, maybe even anger. But what he didn't expect was the calmness in Jacob's voice when he finally spoke. "I don't need your pity," Jacob said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. He crumpled the letter slightly in his hand, shaking his head. "I don't need charity or your money, if that's what you think." Thomas was taken aback. "No, Jacob, that's not why I came here. I'm not offering you charity. I just thought you deserved to know the truth." Jacob stood up suddenly, pacing a few steps away, his hands clenched into fists. "The truth," he echoed, his voice rising. "The truth that your father, our father, left me and my mother to struggle while you lived in some mansion, having everything handed to you. That's the truth, right?" Thomas swallowed hard, feeling the sting of Jacob's words. "I didn't know, Jacob. I didn't know about you or about what happened with our father. If I had—" "But you didn't know," Jacob interrupted, his tone sharp. He turned to face Thomas, his eyes filled with pain. "You didn't know because you never had to know. You never had to worry about where your next meal was coming from or whether your mother could pay the rent. You lived in a different world, Thomas." Thomas felt a lump form in his throat, guilt flooding him. "You're right, I didn't have to worry about any of that. But that's why I'm here now. I want to help. We're family, Jacob. I don't want to leave you like this." Jacob let out a bitter laugh. "Family?" he repeated. "What does that even mean? Where was this family when I needed it? Where was my father when my mom was struggling to keep us fed?" Thomas had no answer for that. He didn't know how to respond, didn't know how to make up for the years of neglect, the years Jacob had been abandoned by the man they both shared as a father. Jacob's face softened for a moment, and he sighed deeply, the anger leaving his body. "Look, I don't hate you, Thomas. I don't even hate our father. But I don't need anything from you." He paused, looking Thomas in the eyes. "What I've learned out here on the streets is that family isn't about blood. It's about who stands by you when things are tough. Who's there when it matters. And you know what? I've had people in my life who've shown me more kindness than our father ever did." Thomas stared at Jacob, the words sinking in. His offer to help seemed so small, so meaningless now. He had come here expecting to fix things with money, with apologies. But Jacob didn't need any of that. What he had been searching for his whole life wasn't a brother with wealth and privilege. It was a sense of belonging, of real connection. "I'm sorry," Thomas whispered, feeling the weight of everything settle over him. Jacob gave him a sad smile. "Don't be. Just think about what really matters in life, Thomas. It's not the money, the houses or the cars. It's the people who stand by you when everything else falls apart." Thomas nodded slowly, the realization dawning on him. For the first time in his life, he understood what Jacob had been trying to tell him. Family wasn't about blood. It was about love, about showing up when it mattered most. After their emotional conversation, Thomas couldn't just walk away from Jacob without trying to help. He felt a deep sense of responsibility and guilt for the life his half-brother had endured. Before they parted, Thomas made a final attempt to bridge the gap between them. "Jacob," Thomas said, standing before him with genuine concern, "let me help you. I can give you a place to stay, get you back on your feet. I have the resources. You don't have to live like this." Jacob looked at Thomas, the same calmness in his eyes that had been there since the beginning. He shook his head, a faint smile on his lips. "You still don't get it, do you?" he said softly. "I don't need money or a fancy place to live. That's not what life is about." Thomas frowned, confused. "But I don't understand. Why would you choose this life? You've been through so much. Don't you want a chance to have more?" Jacob sighed, looking at the bustling street around them. "I've learned something in my time out here, something money can't buy," he explained, his voice steady but full of emotion. "True wealth isn't measured by what you own. It's in the kindness you show to others, the love you give, the wisdom you share. Those things, love, kindness, wisdom, they've kept me going when I had nothing else." Thomas stared at Jacob, realizing that despite their different lives, Jacob had found a kind of peace and clarity that he, with all his money, had never truly understood. Jacob had lived through unimaginable hardships, yet here he was, teaching Thomas about the deeper meaning of life. "I'm grateful for your offer," Jacob continued, "but I don't need what you're offering. I've made my peace with where I am. It's not the life you know, but it's mine." Thomas wanted to protest, but something in Jacob's voice stopped him. It was clear that his brother had already found something far more valuable than the material wealth Thomas had grown up with. Thomas realized he had been looking at life through a narrow lens, valuing only the surface things: money, success, power, while Jacob had discovered the wealth of the human spirit. They parted ways that day, with Thomas promising to check on Jacob again. But as he drove away, his mind was filled with questions. How had Jacob found this wisdom through such pain? What lessons had Thomas been blind to all these years? Days passed, and Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he should have done more, should have spent more time with Jacob. He was starting to reconsider his own values, to rethink the way he had been living. He began to understand what Jacob had been trying to tell him, that wealth, real wealth, was about connection and the love you give to others. But just as Thomas was beginning to change, Jacob vanished. He drove back to the spot where they had met, hoping to find Jacob sitting on the curb. But there was no sign of him. Thomas searched the nearby shelters and asked around, but no one had seen him. It was as if Jacob had simply disappeared into thin air. Worry began to gnaw at Thomas. He visited one of the local shelters where he had seen Jacob before. There, a woman with kind eyes gave him the news that shattered his heart. "Jacob passed away," she said gently, her voice filled with sadness. "We found him a few nights ago. He died in his sleep." The words hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. Jacob was gone. His brother, the man who had opened his eyes to so many things, was gone. Thomas stood there, his heart heavy with grief and regret. How could Jacob be gone so soon after they had reconnected? But before Thomas could fully process the loss, the woman handed him something, a small worn notebook. "He left this for you," she said quietly. It was with his things. Thomas took the notebook, his hands trembling. The cover was old and frayed, but inside, the pages were filled with Jacob's handwriting. It wasn't a diary, but rather a collection of thoughts, lessons, and reflections that Jacob had written over the years. Page after page was filled with simple but powerful words about love, hope, and wisdom. As Thomas flipped through the notebook, tears welled up in his eyes. Each entry seemed to carry a piece of Jacob's soul, his quiet strength, and his understanding of life. It was clear that Jacob had known his time was coming, but instead of fearing it, he had embraced it with the peace he had spoken of. One entry stood out to Thomas, written in bold letters near the middle of the notebook. "True wealth is in the heart, not in the hand. Love is the greatest gift you can give, and wisdom is the greatest treasure you can leave behind." Thomas sat down, clutching the notebook to his chest as he wept. Jacob had lived a life of hardship, but he had left behind a legacy far greater than material wealth. The lessons in the notebook, the love and wisdom Jacob had shared, were gifts that Thomas would carry with him for the rest of his life. In the end, it wasn't the fortune Thomas had inherited from his father that mattered. It was the lessons Jacob had left him, the truths about life that Thomas had been too blind to see until now. Jacob had given him the greatest gift of all, understanding. Thomas closed the notebook, his heart heavy but full of resolve. He knew what he had to do. He would carry on Jacob's legacy, using his resources not just for himself, but to help others, to spread kindness, and to live a life with meaning and purpose. Jacob was gone, but his message lived on, and Thomas would make sure it was never forgotten. In the end, Thomas was transformed by the connection he shared with Jacob. The brother he never knew had shown him a world far beyond the glimmer of his wealth and the comfort of his privilege. Jacob, despite his life of hardship, had imparted a wisdom that Thomas had spent his entire life missing. Thomas began to see his riches in a new light. They were no longer a means of personal satisfaction or a measure of success, but a tool for creating real, meaningful change in the world. Inspired by Jacob's lessons, Thomas decided to use his wealth to help those who had been forgotten, just like Jacob had been. He funded shelters, programs for the homeless, and resources for those who had fallen through the cracks of society, ensuring they would have the opportunities that Jacob had never had. Jacob's life, though marked by hardship and pain, had given Thomas something far more valuable than money: purpose. The lessons Jacob left behind in his notebook guided Thomas every step of the way. Thomas realized that his wealth meant nothing without a higher purpose, and that the true measure of a life well lived was not in what you owned, but in the love, kindness, and wisdom you shared with the world. Jacob's legacy continued through Thomas, and the transformation in Thomas's heart became his greatest success. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more captivating stories like this one. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you.